Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm sorry I cannot be in the Cambridge prestigious grass, but another day this will be. Okay, so what I'm going to present today, in fact, is more of, if you want, more lecture type, a summary of some results of papers I have been working lately with Jose Azar and with Albert Banal, George Saldeslack, and Angel Lopez, which they have a common thread on analyzing common ownership and implications for common ownership for competition, and the macro implications, the implications for innovation, etc. I may talk a little bit more about the paper by Banal, Albert Banal, and with Albert Banal and George Saldeslack, because this we're working on now, and this is also an empirical paper. All the others are theoretical, although there is some calibration. Okay, so let me just as motivation, if it is needed. This is a pre-COVID world, okay, but there were car booking companies in the pre-COVID world in which they had lots of links, both in terms of cross ownership and common ownership. Okay, so for example, Uber and Didi, Uber and Grab, they hold stakes, and then SoftBank had positions in different of these car booking companies, or Tiger Global, or Fidelity, etc. This has raised even some competition concerns, particularly in Asia. But this is just to make the point that many industries today, they display a pattern of having common owners, and perhaps more common owners than cross ownership, but still quite a few industries also, they keep patterns of cross ownership. And obviously, so here the general theme, or the general question, if you want to be put, is whether these patterns may aggravate the market power problem, or may aggravate the oligopoly problem. So I will go very briefly over some trends on oligopoly and institutional investment and the changing ownership patterns of firms. I would take that these are mostly known, so I will go very quickly. And the changes in corporate governance, on all these I'll go very quickly. And then I will try to ask the question whether this influence of common ownership and the effects can be understood more in terms of increased market power, or because of efficiency considerations, going back as a general bake, if you want, frame on the structured conduct performance paradigm, which was fashionable very long ago in the 60s or something like that. And so if I have time, I'll take some efficiency defenses, and I'll conclude perhaps with some antitrust implications, because we do not have much time. So what certainly seems to be true is that oligopoly is widespread and on the rise. So if you think of the digital companies, they are very big, and they are very big in their niches also, and there is quite a few evidence of growing product market concentration, particularly in the US. I mean, so situation in Europe and other places is slightly different, but let me stick to the US evidence. And this goes together with an increase in economic profits and markups, although this is much debated, the size of the increase, and I'm not going to go into that. Also in labor markets, evidence of oligopsony and monopsony in labor markets, and it goes together, they have implications for inequality in terms of the declining labor share, for example, also particularly in the US. This goes together with some general concern, and this was after the previous crisis, a lack of dynamism of the economy, in particular in entry and exit, and investment and innovation. And also this kind of weak recovery that we had, that now we maybe will think it was very good, but in the pre-COVID world we thought it was relatively weak. And then this idea of a potential secular stagnation of advanced economies, which maybe had something to do with increased market power. On the investor side, the world of Berlin means, 1932, of dispersed ownership, so this no longer occurs. We have large asset managers like BlackRock or Vanguard, State Street, or Fidelity, and this industry has become very much concentrated, in particular because of the increase in passive funds and tremendous economies of scale. And as I say here, for close to 90% of S&P 500 firms, the three big ones constitute the largest shareholder. And there are many indicators of this type. And as I said also, there has been an important shift from active to passive investors, basically to index funds or to funds which basically follow indices. This does not mean that these passive investors are passive owners, because they can voice, they can maybe not exit, but they have a voice, and they do influence firms. Okay, so this is just a slide to make the point that if we get in the US the average institutional ownership by type, we see that during all institutions from the 80s it has been increasing, okay, and here we would see probably still more if we extended it, and that this increase basically is due to what here is called quasi-indexers, which are basically passive funds or similar index funds or close to index funds. Now this raises the question of what's the objective of the firm with this type of overlapping ownership. In principle, because the manager of the firm, if he wants to account for the interests of the shareholders, and the shareholders have interest in other firms, in other sectors, but also in the same sector, they should take it into account. A parsimonious assumption that that takes this on board was proposed by Rothenberg, also by other people, that the manager of a firm maximizes a weighted average of the shareholder utilities. Okay, so it takes into account, and the weights then may be depending on the influence of those shareholders or their kind of control weights that are influenced by those shareholders. And there are micro foundations of this type of model, which I do not have time to go into. A classical framework that puts this to work, in a sense, an operational framework, is due to Saloff and O'Brien, in which basically, let's consider a particular industry with J firms and I owners, and then the ownership share of a firm, let's say firm J, that goes to investor I's new IJ, and then the control rights that this share confers may be different. If we have a typical assumption of proportional control, then the nu will be equal to the gamma, but need not be. Okay, this may be non-linear, but in here, in fact, for the talk, we'll stick mostly to proportional control. Then the total portfolio profits of an investor, well, is just the aggregate profits according to the ownership shares the investor has. And then if the manager takes into account the interest of the shareholders according to this control weights, it's easy to see that the manager of a firm would maximize the profits of the firm plus the profits of the firms according to some weights, some lambdas. And these lambdas would be would depend on the relative degrees of concentration of ownership of control of the firm versus the other firm, or firm J versus the other firms. Now, this in fact goes back a long time ago, this type of internalization, so Edgeworth used it for the contract curve and other people, but basically I think now it can be a useful tool to model in a very kind of parsimonious way the potential effects of common ownership and also or cross ownership. It's just that the lambdas would differ. Specific example, and that's what we look at in the work with Albert Van Ala and George Salderslag, is to look at well, to divide the investors between active and passive, and still look at a very symmetric situation in the theoretical model, well, not in the empirics, but just for simplicity. And then we think of each firm with a distinct set of active, passive, active and passive major shareholders, and which one of those is a minority shareholder in the other firms. And then assuming proportional control, what we find is that if passive investors are more diversified than active ones, and this is true, this is what happens in reality, then increases in the relative holdings of passive investors, which again, that's what happens in reality, will increase the lambda, will increase this profit internalization, okay? And also the increases in the degree of diversification, in this case, is of both, while the effects of the increase of concentration of active investors, in fact, would be negative, and on passive investors would be ambiguous, in particular because the passive investors are more diversified than the active ones. So then later on, I will tell you about some empirical analysis with accomplished data at the level of X4 in this time frame, in which we basically try to test this type of model and the effect on markups. I don't have much time, so I will not dwell into that, but it's just to see that we can define the empirical variables, which are the relative level of overall holdings, the degrees of portfolio diversification, the degree of ownership concentration, and the lambdas in terms of these betas, which are the proportions of shares ownership of investors in every firm, and under the assumption of proportional control. Okay, so you don't have to look at the formula very much, just delete them for the moment. You can look at the pictures though. What we see that in the period we are looking at, the lambdas are growing. So this is the average lambda. So this load that the manager of a firm should place on the profits of the other firms in the industry, because of the common investors, has been increasing. And the passive also, the holdings of the passive relative to the active have been increasing, as I said before. And the passive are more diversified. If we look at the level of diversification of the passive is larger than the diversification of the active. Okay. The effect of that is that, well, this lambda, total lambda, average lambda, if you want, across many industries in the US, in fact, it has increased. And when we go, if we try to disentangle the contribution of active and passive, this is basically due to the contribution of the passive investors, which is the blue line with respect to the red line. Okay. Okay, so let's go back now to our question on how on the potential relaxation of competition that common ownership induces, and potentially efficiency effects. Let me remind you very quickly of what was the structured conduct performance paradigm that I studied, but I am not sure anyone studies it anymore in IO. So this basically, the idea was quite empirical, cross-section of industries, and basically saying more concentrated markets protected by barriers to entry earn higher price costs and margins and profits without caring very much about conduct. Okay, then came Chicago, the Chicago school, and said, okay, well, this maybe if there is a correlation between concentration and let's say price cost margins, a positive correlation, this could have an efficiency explanation. It's just that large firms are more efficient, command larger price cost margins, and earn higher profits, and this basically sets a ceiling for the efficient firms that may survive, but then they make less profits. The new version of this efficiency hypothesis are the superstar firms papers, which say that those papers are those firms are very efficient, are favored by technological change, gain market share, and increase concentration and margins, but this is because they are very efficient. Okay, so we've gone back to this after with slightly more sophisticated analysis. Okay, so if we go back to our beloved Cournot model, and we introduce common ownership, then we have the learner index of a firm, so margin over price, right? Instead of being just the market share of the firm divided by the elasticity of demand, we have to add some term which depends on a kind of a weighted sum of the market shares of the rivals. And the lambdas are the profit internalizations. And then this goes, I mean, from this you go to you see immediately that the average, the weighted average learner index for an industry would be equal to a modified Herfindahl divided by the elasticity of demand instead of the Herfindahl. And the modified Herfindahl is the Herfindahl plus a certain delta, which again depends on market shares and the lambdas. Okay. If you look at this in an impressionistic way in the US, well, then you see that the learner index, this aggregate average learner index by industries, has oscillated quite a bit, but that this modified Herfindahl basically picks up the trend. Okay, so so there may be something to the story. These are just correlations, okay, but it may be suggestive that there is something there. And there has been a lot of empirical work on this, on what we could term this market power hypothesis augmented, no, which could be, we would say, firms in markets with high levels of overlapping ownership controlling for owners for concentration earn high price cost margins and profits. Okay, and in fact there is both evidence and calibration which would be consistent in the sense, I've done some calibrations with Jose Azar and Bacchus et al. Also have done it, in which the evolution of common ownership in the US can match the evolution of the perceived evolution of margins on the different assumptions. And then there is industry-specific evidence on airlines and banking and others, which is controversial because basically uses the modified Herfindahl, which is an endogenous object. And this has generated a huge and somewhat acrimonious debate, I would say. If you've been in some of these debates, you know what I'm talking about. What I will tell you a little bit later in my work with Albert Van Al and Joe Selleslax is that what we try to do to sidestep this is not using the modified Herfindahl, but look directly at the measures of lambdas. Okay, so to try to explain the lambdas and then how the lambdas impact on macros. Okay. Obviously, before doing that, we also should think that maybe, again, there is an efficiency explanation, and the efficiency explanation a la Chicago would go more or less like this. High levels of common ownership and efficiency are associated because common ownership improves all kinds of efficiencies: information sharing, internalization of horizontal and vertical external effects, corporate governance, etc. And it uses managers to be more efficient and to improve performance. And if this is true, then large firms typically will have more common ownership links, and then again, better corporate governance, will be more efficient and will command larger price cost margins and earn higher profits. Okay. And there is also some evidence which is not inconsistent with that, with US across public firms and also on vertical links. I would say again, the evidence is not maybe it's not a structural. No, there is more correlation than anything, but still, you may think that there is some of that. What do we get in our work with Albert Van Al and Joe Selleslax? Well, we take now an approach that quite a few people take, which originates in DeLocker and Warszynski, a production function approach, in which the markup of a firm is equal to the elasticity of output with respect to a variable input of a revenue share of this variable input. Okay, and then you assume a Cobb-Douglas production function, and you measure the variable input as cost of goods sold. The measure of capital is net capital. And then we allow for common ownership structures also to influence future productivity. So in fact, we introduce a potential efficiency effect in that increases in common ownership may improve the productivity of the firm in the empirical estimation. Okay, and then we do a two-stage least square estimation, yearly firm level lambdas as a function of ownership variables, which this links financial markets to common ownership. So this is trying to, one part of the estimation is trying to explain a common ownership pattern through the investment phase, if you want, and the other is how common ownership affects the markups. And this with yearly firm level markups as a function of the lambdas, which is this internalization of profits that we have obtained in the first stage. Okay, then some preliminary results. We have some different approximations. One is linear, the other is logarithmic. But in particular, I will show you this one, which is linear one with robust standard errors. The empirical results are basically go according to theory. In the first step, we try to explain the lambda, the internalization, this parameter of internalization through the relative holdings of passive versus active. In particular, on the industries, which is the most industries or many industries where diversification of the passive is larger than diversification of the active, and we find significant results. Also separately, the diversification also raises the lambdas, more diversification of the investors, and there has been quite a bit of increase of diversification of investors, and then the concentration of investors has a negative effect. This is to explain what's behind the profit internalization, and then in the second stage, if you want, we look at the impact of this lambda on the margins, and also we find it significant. Okay, so this is not really a structural estimation, but again, maybe indicative that there is something there. What about efficiency defense? And by the way, but here, in fact, what we do not know, what we cannot disentangle yet, maybe we'll be able with some more work, is that this increase in margin may be because the higher lambdas, more common ownership, increase the productivity of the firms, let's say the lower cost, or because they raise prices. Okay, we just look at the impact in the markup. Okay, so still this would be consistent in principle with both hypotheses. So it can be market power, or it can be efficiency. So to disentangle this is not easy. What can be then these efficiencies? What can they be? Well, the efficiencies are of, at least the ones I have analyzed, are of two sorts. One, which is my work with Ángel López in our JPE paper, is that this common ownership may help internalize technological spillovers, okay, which, as we know, they are a drawback on the investment in R&D. And then in the framework that we look at that is, again, a framework asymmetric in the, this is pure theory, is symmetric. Again, the manager of firm J at the end of the day ends up maximizing something which is just the profits of the firm plus some weight of the profits of the rivals in an industry, where this lambda may come from common ownership or from a cross ownership. It's just that then the lambda has a different relationship with the deep parameters of the model. So this would be with silent financial interest, this would be with proportional control. And the only thing you have to, the only intuitive thing that I think is worth retaining here is that the same stake may have different lambda implications, in particular, more profit internalization, typically if it goes together with more control. Okay. Okay, so then we look at a simple R&D gain where in the basis scenario, let's say Cournot or Bertrand, you choose R&D and price or output, and then there are technological spillovers. Okay, and what are the technological spillovers? The technological spillovers basically, think of a cost reduction model, is that if I invest something, part of this investment also benefits my values. Okay, so there is a coefficient, which is a coefficient which has been empirically estimated and tends to be relevant in particular in some industries. And the issue, the state of the art, is this paper by Bloom et al. In Econometrica, in which they they claim that the socially optimal level of R&D investment is between 2 and 3 times as high as the level observed, precisely because of these technological spillovers, and they estimate this spillover coefficient as 0.4, 0.5 from 0 to 1. Okay. What results, what theoretical results do we get? Well, the first one is that the impact of the lambda on output, let's say this is Cournot, and on R&D investment to reduce cost, depends on the level of the spillover. If spillovers are very low, well, then it's like if we have no spillovers, more profit internalization relaxes competition, reduces output, reduces R&D. Okay. If we go to the opposite region with very high spillovers, we have exactly the opposite, increasing the internalization, increases the amount of R&D investment and output. So increases everything. You enter, if you want, a more virtuous circle, you produce more and you want to invest more. And then in an intermediate situation, you still invest, you increase investment, but this is not enough to raise output. Okay. And then we can see how the thresholds of these regions depend on the level of concentration. So typically they are increasing with market concentration. So more market concentration means that we'll be more in the left side. Okay, we'll be more in the left side. And then we have several testable predictions of this theory, like for example, that a positive relationship between overlapping ownership and R&D should be found in industries with high enough spillovers and low enough concentration. The positive association should extend to output in industries with high effectiveness of R&D, which I have not talked about, but let's assume it. And then the impact of overlapping ownership on R&D should be, okay, let's forget about the last one. Okay, so let me just advance so that I do not go over time. So this is what the market does. And in fact, so another important thing, and in fact this is the last one, is that there is a strategic complementarity between the level of spillovers and the level of common ownership. Okay, so that if you are in an industry with higher spillovers, then marginally, it's marginally better to increase the level of common ownership to increase R&D. Okay, so that's another testable implication. In fact, is the last one. This is positive, if you want. Can we say anything normative? Well, we have a similar partition of the space of spillovers for normative results, which basically would say, okay, if the regulator could fix the level of common ownership, the level of profit internalization, what level would it fix? Well, again, if beta is very small or small, then neither with a total surplus standard or a consumer surplus standards you want any common ownership. Okay. Then if beta is large, then you would like, under both the standards, you would like some common ownership. And then for an intermediate beta, you would allow some common ownership when you care about the profits of the firms, but not when you care only about output and prices. Okay, which I think makes sense. And then these optimal levels, when they are positive, are still increasing in the level of spillovers. Okay, and then also, well, we can find results how with the level of concentration, so it will increase. So more competitive industries may allow a higher lambda, J is the number of firms, and also the optimal one would, the optimal lambda would increase with the elasticity of demand and of the innovation function. Okay, so this gives us some results about the welfare analysis. Let me skip that, and let me say something to conclude, and so to leave time for questions on potential macroeconomic effects. And these are the, in fact, two papers with Jose Azar. So now embed basically the model that you've seen, but in a general equilibrium framework, and also with the labor market, and where firms can have market power both in the product and in the labor market. And still the firms, there is a common ownership structure, which depends on the degree of diversification of investors. And each firm will maximize the share weighted average of shareholder utilities, as we have assumed before. We'll have a class economy, so it's more a kind of a Kalekian model, where you have owners and workers, workers work and owners own, okay? So owners do not work and workers do not own. This is a simplification, okay, but it works for our purposes. And the owners then own, if I'm an owner, I own a little bit of a firm, and then I invest in an index fund, which diversifies my investment. And then what we find is that an increase in this general equilibrium framework, an increase in effective market concentration, which accounts for overlapping ownership, leads to depressed employment, real wages, and labor share. Okay, so this is a little bit connects with the secular stagnation idea that the secular stagnation may have something to do with an increasing market power, in particular if it is a kind of secular increase in market power. And then also we find that controlling common ownership and reducing concentration are complements in fostering employment, while government jobs are a substitute to those policies, and let me not go into that here. Now, if we introduce multiple sectors in the economy, then, and we allow investors to diversify intra-industry and also inter-industry, then we find another interesting result is that common ownership need not be always anti-competitive because there is a positive intersectoral pecuniary externality, which depends on the impact of profit internalization on market power in the product versus labor market, which is pro-competitive. Okay, so I don't have time to, I will need some time to explain it more carefully, but the basic idea here is that even with no vertical links, the common ownership may have some pro-competitive effect in a general equilibrium framework. Okay, let me skip the antitrust implications that we can discuss in the questions, and then let me just conclude. Overall, what I have claimed here is that the patterns of firm ownership have changed. And then this, and in particular because of the overlapping ownership phenomenon and its growing importance, should make us revise the standard profit maximization hypothesis for every firm. And then a way to take this on board in the analysis is integrate oligopoly and ownership structure with this parsimonious, we could call the Edgeworth lambda model, no? Okay, so where there is lambda weights on the profits of the rivals. And then if we examine both the theory we have and some of the preliminary evidence, point at potential market power concerns, but also as well as some internalization, potential internalizations of external effects, no, associated to the increase in common and overlapping ownership. And this may call for maybe enhanced antitrust scrutiny, in particular in industries where where there is strong common ownership patterns. The European Commission already has started in some cases, I think, to look at that more carefully. But in any case, traditional competition policy, that's to say controlling market concentration, adjusting the usual one, is still a valid tool in a world of overlapping ownership. But then maybe the caveat, and also which has some connections with inequality and our concern about inequality, is that antitrust should take also into account general equilibrium effects, when typically it has never gone into this direction, right? In any case, the key elements to define a policy towards these overlapping ownership arrangements, according to our models, would be to have a look at the extent of intra-industry versus inter-industry ownership arrangements. So, to put it bluntly, it's not the same Warren Buffett owning big blocks of all the airlines in the US, right? Than having a very diversified fund. By the way, Warren Buffett has sold all his stakes in the airlines, so this must be because the airlines are doomed. Okay, so don't buy a stock in an airline. I would not buy it in any case, or maybe they are very cheap. And
Javier, we need to conclude to.
I conclude. Yeah. 2 lines. It's just I am 2 lines from the conclusion. So also the types of overlapping ownership arrangements should be considered. So it's not the same silent financial interest, that partial cross ownership or the proportional control. We should also take into account the extent of the externalities and the relative structures also, if you look at the general equilibrium of the market structure of the product and the labor market. And I will leave it here. Thank you.